Hey everyone, glad you're with us again this week as we continue our study in the book of Matthew. Now, the last couple of weeks we have looked at and discovered that the law is not so much about our actions, but was directed more to at our hearts. And the Jews in Jesus' day, they misunderstood the law and really saw it as a list of things that we were to do with little or no focus on changing the individual's heart. And to be honest with you, many today in the church have this exact same idea that the law is just about do's and don'ts. And Jesus comes along and he teaches that what is important is our heart. And he taught that things like having a pious spirit or staying faithful to righteousness even when the wicked take advantage of the righteous and make their lives difficult, that's the kind of thing that is important. He goes on to commend those who are meek, willing to let God fight their battles for them instead of always trying to fight their own battles. People that have a heart that hungers for righteousness. People that are merciful to others, just as God is merciful to us. People that are of peace, peacemakers, people that have a pure heart. Those are the people that Jesus said are truly following the law. So we can see that the focus in Jesus' teaching is that the heart be changed instead of just actions changing. Now, we do know that Jesus will teach actions, and those actions will arise from our heart. He'll teach that later on when we get to Matthew chapter 15. But even before we get there, we can get this idea even from the Hebrew Scriptures. We can go to Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, and it says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life." In other words, the actions of our life come from the intent of our hearts. So Jesus is teaching against bad actions, but he does so by focusing on the seed of those actions, which is a messed up heart. And since the people thought he was, in essence, changing the law, he had to tell them that nothing in the law was being changed. In essence, Jesus was saying that the law was really focused on the heart as much as the actions. And he'll spend the rest of this chapter explaining that. In fact, really, most of the rest of the sermon that he is going to be preaching that will continue on through the end of chapter 7, most of the entire sermon is going to be focused on the heart and how our heart needs to change. And we will see that as we progress through this sermon. But the focus of today's lesson is really on the rest of chapter 5 and how a correct understanding of the law can not only help us better guard our hearts, but can also help us understand some other difficult teachings in the Scriptures written by people who understood the purpose of the law. So Jesus, understanding that the people misunderstood the law, and part of his mission was to correct that misunderstanding. Remember, he said he's not changing the law. He was fulfilling the law. We've already talked about how that to fulfill the law meant to explain it correctly so it could be followed correctly. Jesus now goes into a part of the sermon in which he does just that. And he shows how the people misunderstood the law, and he explains it correctly. So, still in Matthew chapter 5, in verse 21, you can see Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment.' But I say to you." So did you catch that? Jesus in essence says, "I know you were taught and believe X, but I'm telling you the correct information." And that's exactly what he was doing. He was teaching the people the correct information about the law so that they could follow it correctly. In verse 27, he continues on and he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you," we have it again, Jesus is correcting the misunderstanding about the law so that they could follow it correctly. Verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, verse 33, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you. You see, it's clear that Jesus never did away with the law. He simply explained it so that people, even people today, can understand it correctly and follow it correctly. So if the law is really about the heart, how does all of this work? Well, I want us to look at one passage in this text that is probably one of the most misunderstood passages in all of Scripture. Even by people today, not just the Jewish people in Jesus' day, but even by people today. And that is Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28. And I think if we unpack this, we will have a much better idea of what Jesus is trying to get across. So beginning in verse 27, it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus tells the people that the law says that they were not to commit adultery. And that's true. That's exactly what the law says. However, Jesus goes on to say that if a person looks at another person with lust in his or her heart, then that person is already committing adultery in that person's heart. And so many today have the mistaken idea that Jesus was teaching that if you are married and you look at another person who you're not married to lustfully, then you've already committed the sin of adultery. In other words, looking at a person lustfully equals the action of committing adultery. However, this can't be the case. We can go to James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. We can see how all of this fits together with what Jesus is teaching. So let's begin in verse 13. It says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted, not with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted, peirazo, which means really to have your character tested. Your true self is being tested when you are tempted. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Desire, epithumia. It's the word that we get lust. It's the word that Jesus was using when he says to look at a woman lustfully. Epithumia, lust. It's a desire for something forbidden, something that God says that we can't do. That's what lust is. It's the desire. Verse 15, it says, then desire when it has conceived. So when this evil desire, this lust, has conceived is sulambano, which really means to seize control of. And remember, the heart is where that seed is found that can eventually grow into improper actions or sin. So when that lust, when that desire for evil seizes control of a person's actions, that will give birth to sin. So we can clearly see that the lust is not sin. The lust is simply the improper desire that, if allowed to control a person, will lead that person into sin. The Scripture is clear on this. Therefore, Jesus cannot be saying that just lusting after another person is equal to sin, because lust is not sin. Now, what is Jesus saying? I mean, if Jesus isn't saying that just lusting after another person is equivalent to committing adultery, like most people teach, what is Jesus actually teaching? Well, Jesus is teaching one of the purposes of the law. Yes, the law is a line in the sand that says you cannot cross here or you have violated God's law. John says in 1 John chapter 3 that sin is the transgression of the law. That's what sin is. If we do something that God has forbidden, we have committed sin. That is the definition of sin. And the law is that proverbial line in the sand that screams at us, do not go past this line. It shows us sin. It shows us God's glory, His perfection. And remember, we were created to be imagers of God. And go back to Genesis chapter 1. It says, let us make man in our image. Or a better way of saying that is, let us make man as our imager or as our image bearer. We were created to carry or to bear God's glory or His perfection. That is what we were created to do. Now, we failed miserably, but that really was our purpose for creation. So to violate the law is to fall short of God's glory. To do something that God would not do, we fall short of God's glory. This is why Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, for all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. That's what he's talking about. We did not carry God's glory the way we were supposed to when we commit sin. And like I said, another way of saying this is when we display actions that God would never display, that's sin. And the law lets us know what those actions would be. It's a constant reminder that we should never do these things. So is looking at a beautiful woman lustfully, that's the example Jesus is using here, is that the same thing as having sexual contact with her? No. Jesus is not saying that lust is sin. He's saying that when we lust, we are heading in the direction of sin. In fact, we have already committed adultery with this woman in our hearts. And remember, if the seed is allowed to seize control, then according to James, we will commit the sin of adultery. Jesus is in essence explaining a second purpose of the law. It serves as a warning sign for us. When we begin to veer from the correct path, the path of imaging God, by lusting after another person, the law serves as a flashing sign screaming at us, go no farther. It's saying you're already committing adultery in your heart. If you allow this lust to continue, then you will cross the line of falling short of God's glory and commit sin. In other words, the law provides us with a chance to monitor our own hearts. When we see our desire or our lust taking us in the direction of sin, then we have the law flashing at us saying, get your heart right. As long as we get our heart back to where it should be, desiring righteousness, desiring to image God, then we will get back on the right path and avert the sin. You see, the law shows us what sin is, yes, but it also serves as an early alert system so we can know that we are getting dangerously close to sinning. The Jews in Jesus' day saw the law only as the line in the sand, if you want to continue using that analogy. Jesus was teaching that the law can also show us our hearts long before we cross the line. This is why Jesus taught having a pious spirit or having a pious heart or having a meek disposition or having a heart that hungers and thirsts for righteousness, having a merciful heart, being people of peace, having a pure heart. This is why Jesus taught these things in what we call the Beatitudes. And he said that is in agreement with the law, that he's not changing the law into that is exactly the same thing as the law. Jesus is saying that the law is teaching us to keep our hearts in check. Then we don't have to worry about our actions, because the issue is our heart. This is why Paul taught in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, so then the law was our guardian. In some translations, which I actually like, it says the law is our schoolmaster. The law was given to teach people how to stay away from sin. Not just where the line of sin lies, but how to stay away from it. It was given to people to teach them how to constantly check their own hearts to see if they were beginning to veer off into sinful actions. So we do need to understand that the law has two purposes. First, it condemns us. It shows us where the line is, so that if we cross that line, we fall short of God's glory. We do so having been told. We've been warned. The line was there. This is the way that the Jews of Jesus' day used the law. Like I said, many people today use the law the same way. However, Jesus and Paul also taught the second purpose of the law. Paul teaches in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, he says, so the law is holy, the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. How can a law that is responsible for our condemnation be a good thing? Well, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, he says, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully or uses it correctly. If we use the law to govern our hearts, then sin is no longer a problem for us, folks. The law teaches us to have the heart described in the Beatitudes. If we have that heart, then we will not commit sin. And Jesus is teaching us that a life pleasing to Him is not all about actions. It's a heart issue. In fact, Jesus is setting the stage. He's setting the foundation for everything, basically, in the gospel. That everything is tied to our hearts. We get our hearts right, we don't even have to worry about sin. We get our hearts focused on Him. Our desire is to please Him. Our desire is to follow Him. We give Him our hearts. We don't have to worry about sin. Yes, we will still sin from time to time. We will fall short of God's glory. But what Jesus is going to teach as we continue on through the gospel is we don't have to worry about it. He has taken care of that problem. Our issue is focus our heart on Him. And the reverse is also true. If we have never committed our heart to Him, we don't strive every day to live pleasingly to Him, to follow Him. We're not followers of Him. And it doesn't matter how much we try to live a good life, how much we try not to commit sin. The heart is the issue. If we haven't given our hearts to Jesus to become followers of Him, then the law, that line in the sand, is our problem. So Jesus is addressing that one purpose of the law, the purpose of the law that is focused on the heart. We will continue learning about how our hearts should be directed as we continue our study on this amazing sermon by Jesus next time. Bye-bye.